we tend to look at today's world as a consequence of World War II. Yet in the first years after that war, there were several directions which the world could have turned. There was a chance that China would not have become communist. There was also a chance that Europe would have become much more communist. A few years ago, Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, the current editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, wrote The China Mission, a book in which he explores the attempt by George Marshall, the architect of the Allies' victory against the Nazis, to bring China closer to America. We discuss why this mission failed, how the world could look differently if it had succeeded, and what lessons we can draw from that episode for today's world. We also talk about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine is changing the world now. You're listening to Ukraine World podcast and its series, Thinking in Dark Times. Daniel Kurtz-Phelan is the editor of Foreign Affairs. His book, The China Mission, was published in 2018 and named a Best Book of the Year by The Economist and an editor's pick by the New York Times Book Review. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of Ukraine World, and president of PEN Ukraine. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at paypal.ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find these links in the description of this episode. Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be talking to you.
So I have been reading your book, The China Mission, which is a very interesting book in about how George Marshall actually tried after the end of the Second World War to make China America's ally. And I think you're describing the world which could have looked very, very differently in that way from this moment on. Can you a little bit describe to me why you decided to go with this topic, what you were interested in, and what were the options at that moment after the Second World War between U.S. and China?
Well, thanks so much for starting with my book. The Marshall Mission, which the book covers as Marshall's Mission to China, is this really kind of extraordinary moment in the year after World War II and the kind of very beginning of the Cold War. George Marshall was famous at that time as one of the leading American generals who had helped win World War II, helped lead the Allies to victory in World War II over Germany and Japan. And then he, of course, became famous later on as a Secretary of State who was responsible for, among other things, the Marshall Plan and really kind of helping set American strategy for the Cold War. But this is this kind of amazing 13 months that comes in between those two really remarkable achievements in his career, the things that have made him famous, the things he's always hailed for. This is this mission he sent to China just after retiring from the army, charged by President Truman with brokering a peace between Mao and the communists and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists who had been fighting for many years in China and were kind of on the verge of going back into a civil war that would, as we now know very well, end with the victory of the communists and a really kind of major development in the Cold War and set the course for U.S. relations with China for many, many years. But it was this moment when there was hope coming out of World War II that there'd be a more kind of cooperative approach to international relations, that the five great powers, as the American government saw them, which included the Soviet Union and China, as well as the UK and France and the United States, would kind of come together and be the pillars of order, or the United Nations as it went, that would ensure that the world didn't go back to the kind of terrible war that it had suffered twice in the previous decades. So Marshall was charged with going and making sure that China could be one of these pillars, both by avoiding a civil war, but also avoiding a communist revolution that would really obviously change the geopolitical makeup and change the makeup in China. And what's extraordinary, we know, of course, that he failed. Mao came to power. We know what happened in the Cold War and the U.S.-China relationship from there. But what was extraordinary is that he almost seemed to succeed. There was really hope when he showed up in China in December of 1945, just a few months after the end of World War II, that this great figure, this kind of commanding figure on the global stage, would be able to to fulfill his mission, that he'd succeed and create this new kind of China that would be one of the pillars of this other kind of world order. So the book is in part about why he seemed to succeed and then why he ended up failing, but really also what he took from that, how he learned some of the lessons that would shape the great achievements that came later, including the Marshall Plan and America's strategy in the Cold War, but also what the repercussions of that were for the United States and China, for global order going forward, for the future of the Cold War. So it's this moment when you can kind of see history at an inflection point almost, when it seemed to like it almost could have gone another way. And there are all kinds of interesting lessons and echoes, not just for the United States and China today, but also in the way that we think about all sorts of other issues, including, of course, the war in Ukraine.
So there are several things that your book is leading me in thinking about. For example, that the world could have looked absolutely differently, and you mentioned this possible America-China axis. But what I have learned as well is that, well, the reconstruction of Europe was not something that was evident. That Marshall Plan itself was something that was invented by people like Marshall, but also by some other people. And you call it inflection point in history. And this is really makes us think about the world in a different way. Do you think it's kind of a productive? Because I think, as a philosopher, I think it's very productive to think about possible alternative options. I don't really like the way of thinking about history as, this happened and it should have happened only in this way. I think we need to think about different options of history, and you show us this way. So can we imagine a different world from the World War II, for example, when Marshall, let's say, succeeds with China but fails with Europe, and Europe, continues its struggles inside? And you show brilliantly that actually it was not that evident that the Soviet Union would not penetrate much deeper into Western Europe as it just penetrated in the Central and Eastern Europe.
So you're getting at, I think, some of the tensions and questions that are really at the heart of the story that I'm telling in the book. I mean, one of the things that is remarkable about this episode, and then about kind of history and thinking of history as narrative, as I try to do in this book more generally, where you're seeing it as, trying to see it as the figures involved in shaping that history saw it at the time. So you have this moment when not just Marshall, but also Mao and Chiang Kai-shek and Stalin and Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman. They're all kind of wrestling with these questions in real time, often kind of face to face over, negotiating tables or drinks or at parties, on the sidelines of parties or whatever else. So you have these individuals at the time trying to work through these questions without, of course, knowing how it's going to end. And the story of Marshall here is in some ways about the influence of an individual, the ability of an individual to shape the course of events. But it's also this moment where you watch Marshall realizing the limits of his own power and of American power. So there's this sense that with a figure like Marshall, this kind of great man with this incredible profile, the hero of World War II, and all of the power that the United States had at that point, that it could, with the right mix of diplomacy and leverage and other tools, really change, influence the course of events in China and more globally. And you see Marshall, who's this very can-do figure, really kind of understanding the limits of what can be done. Kind of understanding the structural constraints that he's facing in China. So on the one hand, you see the limits of an individual and of American power in this case to shape the course of history. But then you also see, subsequent to that, Marshall taking lessons from it that would really define the way that he thought about American strategy in the early Cold War and his own role as Secretary of State, that were in fact incredibly, incredibly decisive. So to take two examples of that, one is the Marshall Plan, when Marshall kind of took the lessons that he'd started to learn in China and applied those to Europe. And a lot of that was about understanding that without a serious effort to address the basic needs of people for food and functioning economies and some degree of stability, that there was going to be little hope of staving off the advance of Soviet power and of communism in Europe, including in Western Europe. And that's something you see Marshall really starting to see in China, where at the time there was, the decimation of World War II in China. There was terrible inflation. There was starvation. And Marshall really realizing that addressing those kind of basic needs of individuals was a big part of what was going to decide the outcome of the civil war between the communists and the nationalists. There were, of course, ideological issues, there were geopolitical issues at stake. But when it came down to it, it was going to depend on the decisions of lots of people who were trying to feed their families and live normal lives. And so when Marshall, then as Secretary of State, is looking at the competition with the Soviet Union and Europe, he applies that same understanding, which he's starting to see in China, to Western Europe. And the Marshall Plan, really one of the most important Cold War episodes of statecraft, probably one of the most important and successful examples of American statecraft, probably in American history, grows out of that understanding in China. And without Marshall to help shape it, to make sure the resources were there, to sell it to the American people, you can really imagine that history playing out very differently. So Marshall does, as an individual, seem very decisive there. And it's worth saying one other thing. We can look back as Americans with degree of kind of gauzy nostalgia and think that, of course, the American people at that time stepped up and generously sent what was really an enormous amount of money to Europe at a time when there were plenty of economic problems here in the United States. As a percentage of national income, it'd be almost $1 trillion. So that's a pretty large and generous assistance package in those years. But in fact, there was a ton of opposition to the Marshall Plan, and it took Marshall, who had this incredible profile and stature and credibility domestically, flying around the country and talking to people about why this was in the interest of the United States. And some of that was high-minded and about standing up for the free world and American values. And this is the early Cold War, so getting into some of the ideological dimensions of that competition. But a lot of it was about kind of very basic self-interest and going to groups of farmers or small business people and explaining to them why this was going to be in their interest, even though they might be sending some of their tax dollars to communities in Europe at a time when they might be feeling squeezed as well. That it was ultimately going to be in their financial interest and their political interest to spend this money. So that's certainly something that resonates at this moment when, as you of course know very well, there's been a long and bitter debate about sending an additional assistance package to Ukraine. Even in this moment when we think of American power at its height, American generosity at its height, there was really a political struggle. So on some level, this is not it's not entirely new that there'd be a fierce political debate about this kind of assistance.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those parallels are very interesting, and I noticed that you kind of try to show a certain modesty about America, and you end your book by saying that even at the height of its power, America could not solve every problem. Um, but at the same time, I'm reading your book not only as a testimony of America's would be modesty that it cannot solve any problem and it failed in China, but at the same time as a proof, as you said, that about this incredible role after the Second World War. And I think this is the message that Europeans, contemporary Europeans, sometimes do not really, not all of them, of course, but do not really appreciate. This is what we Ukrainians sometimes telling to Europeans that, look, guys, your anti-Americanism sometimes in countries like Germany or France or Italy, well, there are some reasons, some causes for that. But let's not forget about the origins of the European Union, about the origins of United Europe, and about America's role in Europe's security, and about the Marshall Plan as well. Coming more to today's world, first, let me ask, maybe coming back to your book, what I was also surprised is how much Marshall was criticized afterwards by his opponents, that he failed really to turn China into an American ally.
I was so much surprised with this. So it means that there were so many people in America that thought it would be an easy task, or what do you think?
Yes, I mean, so this is another to go back to your point earlier about the kind of influence of the individual in history. I mean, this is another moment that is really fascinating. I think kind of cuts against the impression most people have, at least in the United States, of that period of our history and our foreign policy. In Marshall's Secretary of State, he's facing this incredible set of global challenges. I'm not. I think it's probably hard to decide whether if you're sitting in the American government now, whether now or then is a more complicated moment. But that was a time when Americans were really starting to focus on the challenge from the Soviet Union in a way that they hadn't a few years before. It's really you kind of see the first arguments about the Cold War and Cold War strategy. And one of the things that Marshall is very focused on is using limited American resources, even at a time when America was quite dominant on the global stage, and of course had a monopoly on nuclear force at that particular moment. But really concentrating them in the places where they would be most meaningful. So even as he's making the case for sending this enormous assistance package to Europe, he's quite skeptical that uh, sending, especially troops to China will change the course of events there. So you have, even as he's pushing for a more expansive American role in Europe, he's arguing with people who want to intervene in a more forceful way, and especially in a military way, in the Chinese Civil War to, in their view, prevent Mao from coming to power. And Marshall, based on his experience in China, is quite opposed to this, not because he doesn't share that basic goal, but because he's one, skeptical that ultimately U.S. force is gonna change the course of the Chinese Civil War in a decisive way, and then second, that at a time when America is facing challenges everywhere, and there's a sense that communism's kind of on the march and has the advantage, that there's really a need to concentrate those resources in the place where they can make the biggest difference. And what this means, that even as Marshall is being hailed as the figures who's helped save Europe with the Marshall Plan and helped craft American strategy and the alliance system, all these kind of pieces of American strategy that would last really through the Cold War. Is of course not the only one, but he's the kind of major figure leading figures like George Kennan and Dean Acheson and others who are driving the formation of that strategy. At the same time as he's being hailed for all of that, he's being attacked very, very viciously as the man who quote unquote lost China. This was really a major theme, a major attack line in American politics in the 1950s. People might know the history of McCarthyism, of Joe McCarthy and his attacks on communist sympathizers and in some cases real spies in the U.S. government. McCarthy really, part of what brought him to prominence was his attacks on Marshall for quote unquote losing China as a result of either communist sympathies or being duped by traders. But Marshall, even someone with this stature, became a really controversial figure in the last years of his life, and was attacked as a traitor by all sorts of people, because he came to this conclusion that there was nothing the U.S. could do at acceptable risk or resources, given everything else that we were contending with, that would change the course of events in China. So that's a counterfactual that we'll never be able to fully explore, obviously. But he made his judgment and was attacked for it. So again, in the American context, there's this tendency to look back on that period of American foreign policy and politics with some degree of nostalgia. That there was more bipartisanship, there was more a kind of respectful debate. There was more agreement on basic tenets of strategy. But one of the things that I think is useful about going back to this history is remembering that everything that we see now was also true back then. And that's not exactly a source of reassurance, but it is a reminder that even in these moments when American strategy seemed to be pretty successful in lots of ways, there was still a degree of bitterness and rancor and these kind of recriminations and attacks on the players involved. So it does, I think, put some of the dysfunction and bitterness of our current debates a little bit in perspective.
So let's talk a little bit what came next. and maybe just briefly to understand why we're living in the world that in which we are living now. And maybe one of the figures of course is Henry Kissinger, who probably is can be described as a anti-Marshall because his approach would be different. I would say that Marshall and the epoch that you are describing, it rather is sort of idealist foreign policy based upon values or the idea of values and certain generosity, while with Kissinger we have this famous American realism. And would you agree with this assessment? And would you see Kissinger as a turning point of America's policy towards China?
So he certainly stands as a figure who drove a turning point in America's policy towards China. I once talked to Henry Kissinger about Marshall and the Marshall Mission. He said to me that he did not admire Marshall because he thought it was always a fantasy that Marshall could have found some way to avoid a civil war and strike a peace deal for a kind of coalition democratic government between the communists and nationalists in China. I think what that missed in some ways was that when Marshall starts this mission just after World War II, it's not yet clear how bitter the tensions between the United States and Soviet Union are going to be. And it's easy to look backwards and say, okay, it was inevitable that you'd have the two sides end up supported by different outside patrons. But in 1945, just after the United States and Soviet Union had been allies in World War II and defeating the Nazis and Japan, there was a sense that perhaps there could be some degree of cooperation. And one of the things that changes over the course of Marshall's time in China is that you get much sharper tensions between Moscow and Washington. And as a result, rather than the two sides, pressing their respective, allies or partners in China in the Civil War, the nationalists in the case of the United States and the communists in the case of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union starts pushing the communists to fight harder. So things change geopolitically, and that's part of what prevents a settlement within China. It's you can see plenty of echoes of this now at moments when there are degree of great power cooperation. It makes it much easier to solve local conflicts once you have tensions. And you could look at the U.S. and China in the context of Ukraine right now as one example of this. When you do have great power tensions, then often you're not going to have the same pressure on respective partners to find some kind of settlement, which in the context of the China-Russia relationship certainly is present now. Back then, it was going in the opposite direction. But Marshall, I think one thing that was striking about him is he was very much, was very kind of inductive and empirical about the way he thought about these things. So he, kind of would understand the tools and had a kind of clear sense of both what kind of power he had available to him, or tools of power he had available to advance these ends, but also what kind of world he was seeking to achieve. But he was very kind of agile in changing tactics as appropriate, and that was true, during World War II. That was true in his statecraft subsequently. So, I kind of whatever Kissinger might have said about Marshall at that time, had Marshall still been alive and observing Kissinger, you can imagine him saying, "This is the kind of compromise that we need to make to defeat the greater challenge." Kissinger's theory was that by by the opening to China and by having a new kind of accommodation between Beijing and Washington, it would give America the advantage against the Soviet Union, which was the kind of bigger focus at that moment. So I think Marshall would in some ways have understood, if not agreed with, the logic of that diplomacy at the time. But that was, of course, another major inflection point in the U.S. China relationship that I think set the terms of the next several decades. But then I think we've seen in the last 5 or 10 years yet another inflection point, a shift away from that period of a relatively good relationship that started with Nixon and Kissinger in the early 1970s and ended, sometime in the last, decade or so after Xi Jinping came to power. And you see a very, very different U.S.-China dynamic now.
Yeah, so let's talk about the world today and see how it is different from the world that you describe in your book. Um, it's everybody whom I talk to about U.S. foreign policy says that okay, China is the major opponent, or is the major challenge, or is the major threat, and this, of course, is totally different compared to the 1940s when you're right, this advance of the Soviet Union and very brutal advance, these coups d'etats in Eastern Europe and in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and very aggressive, move towards this communist rule in Europe, show that Soviet Union is really the major power for the United States. While today in America, I see this perception that Russia is a declining power, and perception of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine as the invasion which has done with lots of mistakes, as the invasion that shows that Russia's army is weak, as the invasion that shows that Russia is very bad at calculating, foreign policy priorities, while the China is the real threat. While for us, for Ukrainians, of course, it's not the case because we see what is happening. That Russia is coming back to its kind of a the political and economic and security system which is the most comfortable for it. The economy can be weak, but the army will be strong, and then violence is one of the key arguments. And then we see in this war that, yeah, Russia has made lots of mistakes initially, but it's learning fast, and therefore it can provide, and is providing already, a true military threat, not only for Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe. And in this calculation, saying that Russia is declining power can be probably is dangerous. Is dangerous. It would be the same as saying that after the First World War, that look, Germany is declining power, so you can do nothing. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, as I'm sure you were watching this closely even before the invasion, the most recent full scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. There was this sense that China was, the pacing challenge is the language that American defense officials and military officers use, but the sense that China was really the thing to focus on, and that U.S. concern about Russia would very much be a kind of subsidiary one. So you even had, some people arguing that there was an opportunity to pull, what is called a reverse Kissinger, right? Kissinger went to Beijing to build a common front against Moscow. Was there a way that people were asking before the war started to go to Moscow, for an American official or president to go to Moscow to find some kind of common front against Beijing, or at least prevent the kind of full consolidation of the Russia-China relationship? And I think that there have been, all sorts of really grim surprises on the Russia front since those months. You said this was, of course, very central to the Trump administration, the sense that Trump and Putin could deal, and that would be good for the U.S. competition with China. But even I think in the early months of the Biden administration, there were figures who were kind of exploring at least ways to have some kind of stability in the U.S. relationship with Russia in order to really allow focus on the U.S. competition with China. And I think some of the reaction to Russia's war in Ukraine in the last couple of years is, on the one hand, to see the limits of Russian power. Obviously, lots of commentators here, I think most observers here, even those who are, extremely sympathetic to Ukraine and Ukrainian interests, and certainly not pro-Russian, kind of expected that the Russian offensive, once it started, would go very quickly, right, and that the Russian troops would be in Kyiv quite quickly, and there'd be little chance for resistance in the near term. And so the incredible Ukrainian defenses and then counterattacks in those early months of the war, I think in some ways reaffirmed the impression that a lot of American observers had that, Russian power, while still, that sells a lot of nuclear weapons, still has a large army, it's a big country with a lot of resources, but that there was a kind of, hollowness to it, or brittleness to it, that you could see on the battlefield in those early months, thanks to Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian bravery and creativity, and Ukraine's efforts in combating Russian troops. But at the same time, um, there has been, I think, since then, a reminder that even it's almost certainly true that Russian power is in decline in some sense. If you look at various indicators, the demographics, the economy, all kinds of ways you can project forward a few decades and see Russia's power declining. But declining power can cause a lot of problems if it's willing to take risks and cross the lines that Vladimir Putin is willing to. So I think if you went back to 5 or 6 months into the war, there were predictions here from, again, people who were pretty sophisticated observers, smart observers of Russia and of the region, that you'd see a kind of almost complete collapse of Russian power, thanks to Ukraine's resistance, thanks to the Western sanctions regime, thanks to internal pressures. And again, the months or years since then have been a reminder that even if that kind of long-term structural decline is true, that the long term is too long to matter in events right now and in the world right now, and that you can see a lot of destruction, a lot of disruption, even in the context of that long-term decline. So I think that's what certainly American policymakers are grappling with, and scholars and analysts are grappling with, and obviously Ukraine is in a much more intense and direct and costly way. But I imagine there'll be more surprises as we kind of try to understand Russian power and Russia's ability to sustain economically its war effort, Russian political stability. Obviously, it was under a year ago that the Prigozhin seemed to represent again, a kind of a real mortal threat to Putin's hold on power. And so I think it's probably difficult for those of us, sitting on the outside, or even people in Russia, to really understand how resilient that power, how solid Putin's grip is. And again, I think that the coming months there'll be more surprises. Some of those could be pleasant surprises from the perspective of the United States and Ukraine, but I imagine there'll also be some less pleasant ones.
So it's interesting how we can look at international relations from different ways, and I think one of the naive mistakes of those people in America that you described, I mean, you mean Trump administration and some people around Biden, and I can only say about Europeans. I mean, the early stages of President Macron in France were actually the same. We should rather be friends with Russia against China. Well, he meant also probably against United States, Trump's United States, but still, this was the logic about it. And what is wrong and even naive about this logic is that I think this thinking doesn't really understand that values matter, meaning that they only think that interests matter, that you can play or with interests, etc. But when I'm saying values matter, I mean that there are certain leaders and societies which just tend to each other. So Putin wants to be with Xi Jinping not only because of his interest, his economic interest, but just because the structure of society, the ideology of society, the basic values of Chinese society, meaning the hierarchy, servience, the leading role of the leader, are very understandable for Putin and very understandable for the current Russian society, much more than, let's say, European values in European Union or in America. And in this way, interestingly, that these realists like Kissinger, who think that they are really smart and cynical and understand the real world, they, I think, they underestimate this role of certain value proximity. And let me ask you how you see the future of the world, because I see the future of the world in the 21st century as going more and more divisive around these value lines. It's not this clash of civilizations of Huntington, because the borders between these entities are very fluctuating, and Ukraine case shows this. But it will be certainly in the 21st century the clash between certain value systems. Let's say neo-totalitarian value system, and let's say a democratic value system, or maybe some others. What do you think?
So I think it's a you're getting at the kind of core issue in global politics today in a really incisive way. I think you can kind of cut this two ways. Obviously, since the war started, there has been, on the one hand, this kind of consolidation of two blocks. One of them supporting Ukraine, one of them more or less supporting Russia, although the degrees of that support vary according to which member of the bloc you're looking at. And on the sides, backing Ukraine, there's been, I think, lots of celebration. Many of it, much of it warranted. I don't mean to say this derisively, of the kind of free world values, the collective West, democracy standing up together. The sense that Ukraine is very much fighting this fight that matters to the rest of us and matters to the future of the values we care about, to the democratic system. And that's obviously true of the United States and NATO partners in Europe. But you also hear, it's not just traditionally Western powers. You hear it from the Japanese prime minister. You hear it from South Korea. Um, you hear it from Singapore. So there are others who are not themselves European or North American powers who will take the same kind of stand on values lines. And then on the other side, a kind of consolidation of a bloc that includes Russia and China, but also North Korea and Iran. Probably most importantly, that I think if you'd asked most geopolitical analysts, even those who understood these places with some degree of depth a few years ago, the idea that you would see this much, kind of active cooperation among them would have been a bit of surprise. That's obviously been true in the context of the war in Ukraine, but also you now see it in the Middle East as the war in Gaza has started. And a kind of similar consolidation of these powers, and so there's a degree of military cooperation that would have surprised people. North Korea sending artillery shells to Russia, the cooperation between Iran and Russia, China's you know uh, significant degree of support for the Russian economy and the provision of various resources, even if that doesn't cross certain lines that the U.S. has been very focused on. There still is a high degree of support there. So you do see this kind of consolidation of those blocks that you know you can look at this at various levels, but there is clearly a kind of values dimension to that, and you see Xi and Putin talking about their own version of that, and then you see Ukraine and the United States and NATO talking about a version of that. But there's been this other way of cutting it, which one thing that I think people have focused on is, of course, the now kind of much used and probably much abused phrase, the global South. But this other group of countries that don't see the war in Ukraine or other geopolitical battles between the U.S. and China or the U.S. and Russia or these two blocs in the same terms. And so certainly the U.S. has, I think, had to figure out how to, on the one hand, be fighting what is seen as a kind of fight for democratic values and the free world in Ukraine, even as it takes a much more kind of agile and flexible approach to diplomacy with lots of countries that I think we would have assumed on February 24th, 2022 would have supported Ukraine, but have their own view of their interests, and are in some cases are focused on whether it's food prices or oil or their own the threats that they have that may kind of intersect with this in complicated ways that haven't supported Ukraine. And so I think both I've talked to Ukrainian officials about this and American officials who say, okay, even as we're in Europe giving speeches about the universal values, the kind of fundamental values that are at stake here, we're going to have to be flexible and bring some of that diplomatic realism that you could, I suppose, call Kissingerian to our interactions with India or with countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America that are just not going to when you talk to them about the war in these values terms, these ideological terms, it doesn't work. And you've seen, I mean, India is, I think, the most striking example here, where the U.S. has worked very hard to continue building its relationship with India, mostly because of fears about China and Chinese influence, which both India and the United States share. And for India, of course, that's a threat very, very close to home. Even as India has continued to, receives a lot of its own military weapons and supplies from Russia. It's bought a ton of cut rate oil from Russia. It's continued to trade. There are countries that are helping Russia evade sanctions that the U.S. is still pursuing good relations with. So it's been this, I think, kind of fascinating moment where you have these two dynamics really intersecting in complicated ways, and that wasn't something we, I think, fully appreciated at the beginning of the war. Certainly, those of us observing it in the United States. But it's required, I think, a kind of interesting combination of those two dynamics. You have the fight over values and these, this sense of kind of fundamental values clashing on the battlefield in Ukraine, even as you have a much more kind of cold-blooded approach to diplomacy with lots of other powers. And I'm curious if that resonates from where you sit. But I think even Ukrainian officials have after reacting to some of the reticence of countries in the quote unquote global south to support Ukraine, despite what seems like values they would very much share, to become again much more kind of transactional about it, making it about grain exports and figuring out how to get them grain, or oil prices or whatever else. So it's been both of those dynamics, I think.
That's very interesting, and I fully agree with you that we cannot really describe it in one way. And for our listeners, I would just say that we have an episode with Indian authors who actually we met them in Kiev. They came here, and it's a very interesting conversation, also about values and also about colonialism, but of course from different perspectives. Because for Indians, the bad colonial power is Britain. For Ukrainians, the bad colonial power is Russia. But despite the fact that there are different colonial powers, there are so many similarities in this experience, and I do think that there is lots of to talk about. Let me ask you about U.S. foreign policy with regard to Ukraine and the way how you see it. We are talking days after this long-awaited decision to grant aid to Ukraine in House of Representatives and then in Senate. And of course, there is lots of joy in Ukraine, but we also need to understand that this is not sustainable. This is not a sustainable solution, because either, well, we think, for example, that it is still not matching the Russia's military budget. So Russia is still very, powerful and strong, and is really militarizing its economy. Another worrying issue is that what happens next? Will this be like next year, or especially after the results of American elections, which we don't know? And frankly speaking, for me, there are two sustainable options that can help us, stop this war or prevent the future war or just stop Russia. And one option is Ukraine's NATO membership. Another option is Ukraine's coming back to the status of nuclear power, which it lost after the Budapest Memorandum in 90s. And I understand that these two options are probably not absolutely not discussed in America in a serious way. They're thought to be unrealistic. But my question is, what are other options? What are other sustainable options? What is the plan for victory, as everybody is saying? So, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, of course, I think one of the big questions for American policy, and obviously for Ukrainian strategy as well at this particular moment. I think I mean, the Senate just passed, as we're having this conversation, just I think last night passed the assistance package. So after 8 or so month delay, that aid will finally be flowing. And I don't need to say to you or your audience, how consequential that'll be on the battlefield in terms of at least starting to not totally making up for the Russian advantage in artillery shells and troop numbers and everything else, but it will certainly help. We ran a piece in Foreign Affairs a few days ago by the great Ukrainian journalist Natalia Gumenyuk about all the ways in which Ukrainian society and the economy is kind of girding for a long war and kind of getting ready to sustain this effort for a long time. And I think you're right that in the U.S. system we haven't really figured out exactly what that will mean over the long term. Some of this is because of the political context. We're several months away from our own presidential election, obviously, and what a Donald Trump administration would mean for support for Ukraine is, I think, an unsettling question from a Ukrainian perspective, obviously, but not, I think, a totally settled one. Trump is unpredictable and volatile and doesn't, in most ways, hold especially consistent policy positions. So he's obviously said things about the war in Ukraine and a settlement with Putin that I imagine are quite worrying from where you sit. But whether that's in fact exactly what he would do if he were in power is I think not a sure thing. I'm not saying that it wouldn't happen, but I think with the right diplomacy from Ukrainians and kind of depending on who exactly is around him, if there is a second Trump term, that could go in various different directions. I think the biggest divide that you have, or a couple divides, one of which you mentioned, which is about NATO membership, which even as Washington prepares to host a NATO summit this summer in I believe in early July, marking the 75th anniversary of the alliance, there still is reticence on the U.S. part, but also on the part of some of the key European players, starting with Germany, to moving forward on NATO membership as long as the war in Ukraine continues, and opposition among other voices in the American system that I think would even persist beyond that. Then there's this question that I think is complicated for lots of reasons that well, of negotiations. You have American officials say, look, we're going to support Ukraine as long as it takes, and obviously it is Ukraine's war, and up to Ukraine's democratically elected government to decide what the terms of ending the war would be. But they do often say, but we agree with the Ukrainians that there will someday be a negotiation. And I think as you get through this aid package, and this will be months down the road now, but at some point there will be this question about what an additional assistance package looks like, barring some surprising event that would really change the dynamics in the war in ways that I think people, at least in the U.S., largely don't expect at this particular moment. There will be a debate again about further assistance, and that will get to the negotiations question, and that is obviously an incredibly fraught one between Kyiv and Washington. There's just an analytical question of whether anything is a serious negotiation is even possible, or what would make it possible. But just to go back to history for a second, this too is a really common dynamic in the American interactions with partners that it's supporting that are fighting wars that we're not directly a part of. And I think it's worth kind of going back to that history, starting with the Chinese Civil War and the Marshall Mission, to kind of understand the ways those debates play out. This is not entirely new, and it's a dynamic that has played out in various different ways. So there's lots of history that's worth studying there.
Thank you, Daniel. It's very interesting and very very thought-provoking, and I'm glad that we have talked about so many issues, but also looked into the past. And in your book, I really advise it to our listeners, those of you who are interested in foreign affairs, foreign policy. This is a great book. It's written not as a typical, foreign affairs book. It's a very storytelling. You will see the personality of many people. You will see a lot of debate, a lot of details. It's a very literary book, I would say. There is lots of good style in it and storytelling. And thank you for this analysis.
Thank you so much. That is high praise, and I really appreciate it. And it's great to talk to you, and really appreciate the chance to join you.
This was a podcast by Ukraine World, a multilingual website about Ukraine. This is our series, Thinking in Dark Times. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of Ukraine World, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest was Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, the editor of Foreign Affairs. We talked about his book, The China Mission. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support us at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.